Hello, I'm Victoria Kingston, co-founder of the West Cork History Festival. We're really sorry we aren't able to have a physical history festival this year, but we've put together some fantastic digital content for you in its place, available here on our website. We're focusing on two key themes, Cork in 1920 and Ireland and Empire, for which we have recorded a specially commissioned History Ireland Hedge School. We hope you enjoy these, and we look forward to seeing you in person in 2021. You're about to hear Professor Brian Walker of Queen's University, Belfast, who looks at the interconnected patterns of violence between Cork and Ulster during the War of Independence. He also highlights the courage of some individuals in trying to oppose violence within their own communities.
I'm delighted to be here today. I enjoyed very much attending the West Cork History Festival last year. I'm sorry I'm not able to go there this year, but still it's important that the festival keeps going, so I'm delighted to make my contribution in this online lecture this afternoon. My paper is entitled Cork, Lisburn and Belfast in 1920, Connections, Controversy and Conflict. Let me begin by explaining how I became interested in this subject. A couple of years ago, an old school friend of mine came from Canada to stay at our home in Ballylesson, County Down. He told me that he had an ancestor who served in the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary. I have to say, initially, I wasn't particularly interested in that because I know a lot of people who had ancestors in the RIC. However, a few minutes later, he was looking through some of my books and suddenly said he discovered mention of his ancestor, his collateral ancestor, in one of my books, and a book on Michael Collins. So I immediately became very interested. Well, who was his ancestor? His collateral ancestor was none other than Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Smith, who in June 1920 was appointed divisional commander of the RIC in Munster, the most dangerous region in Ireland at that time. On the 17th of July, he was murdered by the IRA in Cork City. His body was taken back to his hometown Banbridge, County Down, for his funeral, after which there were extensive riots in Banbridge and Belfast, which left 20 dead. There's a second reason why I'm interested in this topic. I live in Ballylesson, which is a hamlet some 5 miles from Belfast, 5 miles from Lisburn. In Lisburn Cathedral, there's a memorial to RIC District Inspector Oswald Swanzy. On Sunday, the 22nd of August 1920, after he left the cathedral in Lisburn, Swanzy was murdered by IRA members from Cork. They blamed him, rightly or wrongly, for the murder of Lord Mayor Tomás McCurtain in Cork on the 20th of March 1920. After Swanzy's death, there were riots in Lisburn which saw most local Catholics driven from their homes, followed by very violent sectarian riots in Belfast with 30 dead. The paper, as I've said, is entitled Cork, Lisburn and Belfast in 1920, Connections, Controversy and Conflict. I will explore how these places were connected during 1920. What happened in Cork had a direct impact on the North. Some of the events to be covered here are matters of considerable controversy. Why was McCurtain murdered? How far was Swanzy responsible? Smith was accused of making an especially belligerent speech at Listowel, County Kerry, which made him a marked man. But there are questions over what he actually said. During 1920, violent conflict escalated all over Ireland, but particularly in the places covered here. Some points, I believe, will emerge from this coverage of 1920. The first is the effect of unintended consequences. Some of the events examined here had consequences which the participants had not intended and which would dramatically increase the conflict. Secondly, the old adage that violence begets violence is amply proved here. As one side increased the violence, this led to more violence from the other side. Reprisals against opponents or supporters of opponents were a common nasty feature of this period. At the same time, there were brave people who were willing to criticise violence from their own side, and I want to draw attention to them. The Reverend John Redmond of Ballymacarrett is one of those I'll be talking about. The third point is that this war involved Irish fighting and killing Irish. This was particularly so in the events covered in this paper. Of course, this communal violence did not end with the Truce of July 1921. Violence had become embedded in the politics of the country. Even worse violence between Irish people would follow in the early months of the two new states which came into being after July 1921. First, I want to look at events in Cork. By March 1920, Cork had experienced the early stages of War of Independence with a growing number of actions and attacks on police barracks by Irish volunteers, now known as the IRA, with their links to Sinn Féin. On the 20th of March 1920, however, Tomás McCurtain, Lord Mayor of Cork and Commandant of the Cork No. 1 Brigade of the IRA, was murdered at his home by a number of men with blackened faces. A few days later, a coroner's inquest placed the blame for the death of McCurtain at the door of the state. The inquest delivered a verdict of willful murder against a number of persons, including Prime Minister Lloyd George, as well as District Inspector Oswald Swanzy, who was in charge of the RIC in the area where the murder occurred. There's been dispute ever since about who exactly was responsible for this murder. W. Alison Phillips, in his 1923 account of these events, claimed that extreme Republicans had killed the moderate McCurtain. However, J. L. Hammond, who was there at the time, of the Manchester Guardian, had no doubt that it was the work of state forces, which he encountered, and I quote, washing black cork off their faces in high spirits in his own hotel, end of quote. As regards Swanzy and his role, modern historian Peter Hart has written that the case against him personally, as opposed to the police in general, was at best unproven, end of quote. Various allegations have been made about Swanzy's role, but probably the main criticism that can be made of him concerns his apparent failure to investigate the crime. Nonetheless, he was a senior officer in the area, and Republicans blamed him. Why did members of the RIC kill McCurtain? Daniel Colin, Catholic Bishop of Cork, had no doubt about the reason. In a pastoral letter issued in December 1920, he looked back at events in Cork over the previous 9 months, beginning with McCurtain's murder. He pointed out that earlier that night, RIC Constable Joseph Murtagh had been murdered in Pope's Quay in Cork. He stated that it was certain that it was the murder of Constable Murtagh that gave occasion to the murder of the Lord Mayor. Murtagh had been unarmed and on leave and was shot 7 times by the IRA. Historian Peter Hart has pointed out that this murder followed another incident on the 10th of March, just a short time earlier, when District Inspector McDonough was shot and wounded while guarding ballot boxes in a municipal by-election. That night, the 10th of March, policemen left their stations to smash windows and look for Sinn Féin supporters. It is very likely that McCurtain was murdered in reprisal for these earlier attacks because he was the senior volunteer IRA figure in the area. Bishop Colin strongly condemned Murtagh's murder, as he did McCartan's murder. He declared that the killing of police, he said, was morally murder. McCurtain did not actually approve of Joseph Murtagh's murder. Shortly before his own murder, he sent condolences to Murtagh's family and promised discipline against those IRA members responsible. It is very likely that the murder of Murtagh was the work of the Cork Brigade Vice Commandant, Sean O'Hegarty, and his men. For some time, McCurtain had clashed with O'Hegarty, who wanted a more aggressive policy, including attacks on individual policemen rather than just assaults on barracks. The militant O'Hegarty now came to play a dominant role in the Cork No. 1 Brigade especially after the arrest of the moderate Terence McSweeney in early August. In his pastoral letter of December 1920, Bishop Colwyn observed that since McCurtain's murder, it has, and I quote, become like a devil's competition in feats of murder and arson between members of the volunteer organisation and the agents of the Crown, at the end of quote. At the same time, he bravely issued a decree of excommunication against those guilty of ambush, kidnapping, or murder. His words did not go down well with Republicans. On Christmas Eve, a large gang of men forced their way into the offices of the Cork Examiner, which had published his pastoral, and destroyed all the printing presses. The months after McCurtain's death saw a sharp rise in violence in Cork City and County. Crown Force losses grew to 17 between April and June and 52 between July and September. Over this period, IRA losses went from 3 to 17. The police found themselves under extreme pressure. They were forced to evacuate barracks in more remote parts, which were then burnt by Republicans. Attacks on patrols and barracks caused some police demoralisation. To deal with this situation, the government appointed in early June 1920 a new divisional commander for Munster in the person of Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Smith. A native of Banbridge, County Down, Smith was a much decorated army officer. On the 19th of June, along with other senior officers, he visited the RIC station in Listowel, County Kerry, where the police were unhappy with the proposal to hand over their building to the military and for them to take up more exposed posts. Smith delivered a speech in which he advocated that the police should take an aggressive approach to anyone they believed were carrying arms. One of those present, Constable Jeremiah Mee, objected to Smith's words, which he interpreted as saying that the police could kill with impunity. Smith ordered Mee's arrest, which the others refused to carry out. 5 police officers resigned, including Mee, who afterwards joined the Republican movement. A report of this event, based on Mee's account, was later circulated in the Irish Bulletin of Sinn Féin and then published in the Freeman's Journal 10th of July, causing great public outcry. It was claimed that Smith gave an assurance that, quote, no policeman will get into trouble for shooting any man, and this caused a considerable uproar. Smith himself denied strongly that he used these or other words ascribed to him. District Inspector John M. Regan was asked subsequently to reorganise the barracks in Listowel. He later said about Smith, I knew him when he was in the army in Limerick and would greatly doubt if his words were intended to convey the meaning attributed to them. And the fact that the police in the station were alleged to have practically mutinied afterwards makes their version extremely doubtful. That's what he said. That's what he wrote later. We can note Smith's brief printed order to the police around the time of this original incident, read out in Parliament on the day of his funeral, which repeated his tough approach to policing, but also stated his strong opposition to police reprisals. He said, I wish to make it perfectly clear to all ranks that I will not tolerate reprisals. They bring discredit on the police. I will deal most severely with any officer or man concerned in them. End of quote. Whatever the truth, Smith was now publicly seen as a resolute enemy of Republicans. On the 17th of July, as he sat in the County Club in Cork City, an IRA unit from Cork No. 1 Brigade shot him dead. Train staff refused to allow his body to be transported by train. Instead, a motor convoy conveyed the body to his hometown of Banbridge for burial. These events reverberated in the north. By July 1920, the situation in Ulster was very tense. Elections to Derry Corporation in January saw the return of a nationalist Sinn Féin majority and a nationalist mayor, with the consequent removal of the Union flag from the Guildhall. During April 1920, Many tax offices and customs houses were attacked by the IRA in Belfast, Derry, and other Ulster towns. In May 1920, Sergeant Dennis Maroney from County Clare was shot dead in Derry in a gun battle between the police and Republicans, the first policeman to die in Ulster. In June 1920, major riots involving former UVF and IRA gunmen in June took place in the city, which resulted in 19 deaths. During these months, the IRA burnt unoccupied police stations in various parts of Ulster and also attacked some unmanned stations. In June, the IRA launched a large-scale assault involving several hundred men on the RIC barracks at Crossgar, County Down, but were unsuccessful. So by July 1920, the violence had not yet reached the level seen in Munster, but still it alarmed many unionists at the success of Sinn Féin. People were well aware of events elsewhere from newspaper reports of attacks on police and Southern loyalists. On the 12th of July, Sir Edward Carson spoke at an Orange demonstration in Belfast. According to the Belfast newsletter, he informed the government that the loyalists of Ulster would not submit to be left helpless in the face of their enemies. In the last resort, they would defend themselves. End of quote. This speech has been seen as inciting violence and trouble later in July. It may have done so to some extent, but other speeches at these 12th of July parades also reflected great concern about the rise in Republican violence and how it was now coming to Ulster. Between the 1st of January 1920 and 20th of July 1920, that's just before Smith's murder, 46 members of the RIC were killed, including more murders in the week before Smith's death than any previous week. So tension was very, very high. A member of a well-known Banbridge linen family, Divisional Commander Smith was buried with full honours in the family grave in Banbridge on Thursday, the 21st of July. Afterwards, riots broke out in the town. At first, homes and shops of those believed as Sinn Féin sympathies were attacked. Then attention was turned to the homes of other Catholics, many of whom were forced to leave. A fatality occurred when a crowd attacked the home of Daniel Monaghan, a Sinn Féin candidate at a recent Poor Law election. The inhabitants defended themselves with guns, which led to the death of a 17-year-old Protestant, William Sterrett, who was in the street at the time. Catholics were forced out of local mills by other workers and only allowed to return by signing a statement denying they supported Sinn Féin. Serious disturbances broke out in Dromore, where Catholic homes and Catholic-owned premises were also attacked. Belfast, however, saw the worst of the violence on this occasion. Trouble began in the shipyards, following a lunchtime meeting of workers on the 21st of July. That was the first day back after the 12 holidays and the day of Lieutenant Colonel Smith's funeral. According to a report in the Belfast Telegraph, the meeting discussed the two issues of the murder of Smith and the treatment of ex-soldiers in the yard. The paper described how the barbarous murder of Divisional Commander Smith in Cork on Saturday night greatly excited feeling, is what it said. It also recorded the belief that ex-soldiers were disadvantaged because former shipyard workers had gone to fight in the war and their place had been taken by Catholics. After the meeting, fighting broke out, which led to the violent expulsion by loyalists from the shipyards of so-called disloyal or Sinn Féin employees, which meant not just all Catholics, but also so-called rotten prods, namely Protestant Labour supporters and socialists. There now followed extensive riots in Belfast, which lasted 3 days. Violence spread from the shipyards to elsewhere in the city. Catholics were expelled from other firms. The police and military intervened, but had great difficulty in ending the rioting. The final outcome was 19 deaths, made up of 11 Catholics and 8 Protestants. In his later recounting of these events, Dr. Joseph McRory, Catholic Bishop of Down and Connor, deplored the cycle of violence which had affected the city. He protested that the Catholics of Belfast were punished for, and I quote, the crimes of the co-religionists in the south of Ireland, end of quote. What he called this doctrine of vicarious punishment. In East Belfast, a significant effort to stop the violence and challenge people from his own community was made by the Reverend John Redmond, a voice of common sense and decency, as historian Alan Parkinson has called him. A former 36th Ulster Division chaplain, he administered to the mortally wounded Captain Willie Redmond MP, brother of John Redmond, in his last hours at Messina in 1917. He became vicar of St. Patrick's Church of Ireland Parish, East Belfast, in early 1920. When the riots started, he went onto the Newtownards Road to stop Protestant rioters who were attacking and looting Catholic-owned premises. With the help of his curate, the Reverend Major Frederick Chestnut Chesney, who had commanded a company at the Battle of Passchendaele, he organised bands of unarmed volunteers, mostly ex-servicemen, to prevent rioting. At St. Patrick's Church on Sunday, 20th of July, quote, after being beset 2 days before by a rioting hostile group, end of quote, he denounced the previous days of passion and lawlessness and warned of the dangers of retaliation which led to counter-retaliation, and so the fires of evil keep spreading. The final event occurred in Lisburn in August. After the murder of McCurtain in Cork, District Inspector Oswald Swanzy was transferred to Lisburn, where he resided with his mother and sister Irene. On Sunday, the 22nd of August 1920, coming from morning service at Christchurch Cathedral, he was murdered by the IRA. Members of the Cork No. 1 Brigade had discovered his new location and decided to kill him. They informed Michael Collins, who authorised the killing. 2 Cork men, Dick Murphy and Sean Culhane, who was also involved in Smith's murder, travelled to Belfast and with 2 Belfast IRA volunteers went to Lisburn, where they committed the murder. This event, this murder, had immediate terrible consequences. Crowds immediately gathered in Lisburn. It was assumed that the killing had been the work of local IRA or helped by locals. Attacks were then made on the premises of people believed to be Sinn Féin supporters, before the attention of the rioters turned to the shops and homes of all Lisburn Catholics. A small army detachment arrived, but could only defend the Catholic chapel and convent. The destruction extended to Protestant property. The rioting began on the Sunday and continued for the next 2 days. Many homes of Lisburn Catholics were destroyed, and most Catholics were forced to flee, as historian Pierce Lawler has described recently in a graphic detail. At the outbreak of the rioting, the Reverend J.B. Bradshaw, a curate at the cathedral, and other clergy sought to restrain the crowd, but without success. On the Monday, a meeting of clergy and other citizens, convened by Canon W.P. Carmody of the cathedral, was held in the cathedral schoolhouse. It was addressed by the Reverend H.B. Swanzy, cousin of District Inspector Swanzy. He said that the mother and sister of Swanzy were very anxious that what was going on should stop. Those present formed a police patrol which went onto the streets. They were met with cries such as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And unfortunately, they made no impact on the rioting. The Reverend Swanzy stood up on a box in Market Square and appealed to the crowd to stop the rioting, but was ignored. Later, Swanzy's mother and sister issued a message in the press about what had happened. They said that they were grieved beyond measure at the destruction and loss which has befallen Lisburn. End of quote. Their message continued. They wished through the press, and especially that section of the press which is most likely to meet the eyes of those who have suffered, to say how truly sorry they are that any person should have suffered any sorrow or loss on account of him. They went on to say then, it would have been a real grief to him that anyone should suffer pain or loss of any kind on his behalf. After the shooting, Culhane and Murphy returned to Belfast, where they took the train to Dublin, travelling first class to avoid detection. The train went past Lisburn, and Culhane later recalled saying the smoke over Lisburn as they headed to safety in the south. Then they went to Vaughan's Hotel in Dublin to meet Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy, who Culhane recalled were profuse in their congratulations. Historian Robert Lynch has written, as the Cork men celebrated in Dublin, the nationalist areas of Lisburn were reduced to ruins. The violence spread from Lisburn to Belfast with deadly results. Sectarian rioting began in the Crumlin Road area of North Belfast, engulfed streets in West Belfast, and then broke out in East Belfast. The fighting continued until the beginning of September. The Reverend John Redmond in East Belfast again tried to stop the rioting. He and other clergy issued an appeal on the 26th of August to urge self-restraint. He acted on the streets to discourage rioters and stepped in between loyalist and Sinn Féin nationalist mobs. His volunteers endeavoured to stop the violence. In a sermon at St. Patrick's Church on the 29th of August, he expressed his grief at all the lawlessness in the area and declared how much it was in variance with the spirit and religion of Christ, who had absolutely set his face against the doctrine of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. His efforts, however, had only limited effect. The outcome of the fighting was the death of 30 persons, 17 Protestants and 13 Catholics. Some final observations can now be made. At the beginning of this paper, it was remarked how these events would show the effect of unintended consequences, violence leading to more violence, and Irish killing Irish. The murders of District Inspector McDonough and Constable Murtagh by the IRA caused the murder of Lord Mayor McCartan. The murder of McCurtain by members of the RIC resulted in a hardline takeover of the Cork No. 1 Brigade and a rise in attacks on police. The killing of Divisional Commander Smith by the IRA eliminated a senior RIC officer who was strongly opposed to police reprisals. McCurtain's death ended in the death of District Inspector Swanzy. The killing of Smith and Swanzy by Cork IRA members had dire consequences for the citizens of Banbridge, Lisburn and Belfast. By the summer of 1920, tensions were already high in the north due to the War of Independence and political uncertainties. These murders suffered as a catalyst for deadly confrontation in northern streets. All the victims were Irish. This cycle of violence continued after August 1920. In Cork and Belfast, there was an escalation of attacks, reprisals, and murders. The death toll for Cork has been estimated at 523 for the whole period 1920 to 21, and the majority of these occurred between August 1920 and July 1921. In Belfast, some 80 people were killed from early September 1920 until early July 1921. The truce of the 11th of July 1921 provided a partial lull in these killings, but not for long. Violence had now become part of the political framework and culture. Over the next year in Cork, 34 people were killed. Strong disagreements emerged in the south over the treaty, and rival sides resorted once more to physical force to achieve their political goals. In the ensuing civil war, about 180 lost their lives in Cork. In the north, physical force was also part of the political scene. The new state of Northern Ireland experienced violence between government and anti-government forces and also sectarian conflict. In Belfast, fatalities have been put at around 70 between mid-July and December 1921, followed by some 250 deaths in the period January to June 1922. Peter Hart has commented, McCurtain and Swanzy died because they were nominally in control. The victims were helpless and unarmed when shot. Afterwards, McCurtain, Swanzy and Smith were remembered in very different ways. At a meeting of the Cork Corporation on the 23rd of April 1920, it was agreed that the name of one of Cork's main streets be changed to McCurtain Street. Lord Mayor Clarence McSweeney said it was their duty to do honour to their immortal dead. Later, a number of memorials to McCurtain were erected in Cork, including a statue in the entrance hall to the rebuilt City Hall. McCurtain was survived by his widow and 5 children, including Tomás, who was a leading IRA activist, 1935 to 60. In Lisburn Cathedral, there's a brass plaque placed there by Swanzy's mother and sister in proud and loving memory of Swanzy and, quote, all his gallant comrades who like him have been killed in the unfaltering discharge of their duty and in the service of the country. Irene Swanzy left Ireland and settled eventually in the Fiji Islands. She went on a tour around the world and went to Fiji, met an engineer there, and she was married and lived there. However, for the next 4 decades, on the 22nd of August every year, she placed in the Belfast newsletter a memorial notice for her brother and his gallant comrades in the RIC. Mary Swanzy, the artist, was a first cousin of Oswald and Irene Swanzy. She went on to become what one art critic has recently described as arguably Ireland's finest woman painter. In Banbridge, on the 4th of October 1920, Loyal Orange Lodge 518 was renamed the Colonel Smith Memorial in honour of Gerald Smith. Loyal Orange Lodge 257 was named the Sterrett Memorial after 17-year-old William Sterrett. After Gerald Smith's death, his brother Oswald returned from Egypt to join military intelligence in Dublin. On the 12th of October 1920, he was killed in a shootout with Dan Breen and Sean Tracy. He was buried next to his brother in Banbridge. So let me conclude. During these months in 1920, Cork was intimately linked to Banbridge, Lisburn and Belfast. The War of Independence impacted greatly on all these places, but in different ways. What happened in Cork had direct consequences for the North. In the larger scene, the government, political parties and politicians were involved in a power struggle over the future of Ireland. At another level, citizens faced the consequences of this conflict in their own communities. Some brave individuals spoke out against the violence on their own side, although their words had limited effect. The War of Independence has been described as a war against the British Empire. It was also a war of Irish against Irish, as these events in 1920 have shown clearly. The killing did not end with the Truce of July 1921. Today, we should remember all the victims of this tragedy. Thank you.